No problem. I enjoy it. You take care. Yep.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Get enough to, can you see anything up there?
Yeah, got some great shots of the city up there.
Let's get a picture of you guys with the dog here. Neighbor.
She gets so happy. Look at Lulu.
Hi there. How are you? Your dog gonna go up too? We've had dogs go up. Yeah. His fur legs will give it short and step.
Ed outside probably know a little bit more. We don't really have when they came up. They were here in our door. Okay. Got to be a photograph to show. They did. They did. Yes. Yeah. They're. All right. Yeah. I can't figure out.
Stop it! Stop!
We worked out with the and you can go to our website and look in the cemetery. You'll see all sorts of photos of it. That's what Mississippi Park.
I heard, yeah.
Hey there. Yes. So just the tour for $5.
Yeah. None. Ripped them right off the metal walls of the toilet stalls. Threw all the toilet paper down. Do you know how much that costs the citizens of Manchester? It's awful. They don't seem to connect it, you know. There's that
Well,
carrot.
enjoy the tour.
I will. I've done it before, but I always like doing it.
I'm the former chairman of the trustees of the Manchester Historic Association. We really appreciate you all coming out today. We have lots of events throughout the year, and we have another big one coming up 2 weeks from today. We have a Civil War Day, which is going to be held downtown right across from the library in Victory Park. So if you want to come down, there's going to be a Civil War reenactment, a muster throughout the day, and a couple of different historical presentations by John Clayton, our director, and myself. People ask, what is this building that we've all come to see today? Who was Weston? Well, James Adams Weston was a mayor of Manchester, 4 terms elected, and he was also a governor of New Hampshire, elected to 2 terms. He's one of only 2 men who served as both mayor of Manchester and governor of the state. He left $5,000 in his will when he died in 1896, and the money was to give to the city to build a structure that could be enjoyed by its citizens. He was thinking in terms of recreational use and for scientific research. So Weston himself never set foot. This wasn't built till after he was in the ground. But this was, ground was broken here in September of 1896, and the tower was completed just about a year later with the dedication in September of 1897. So what did you tell me the math said? That makes it
122 years.
122 years old. People who know this area know that there was a very active granite quarry just down this path, and we're going to talk about that as we do this tour. And they assume that that granite came from that quarry. It did not. That granite came from the Bailey Quarry in Hooksett, about 8 miles north of here. The reason was that by the time this was built, this quarry was out of business and had become a swimming hole. And we'll talk about that as we go through the tour. While we're up here, a lot of people wonder about these 2 fine cannon that are both Civil War vintage. You've probably all heard of the Civil War when we had to repel the invaders from the west side of Manchester. This is what it was for. Actually, these are Civil War surplus cannons that came from the Charlestown Navy Yard in Boston. You can see on the sides, right where this young lady is, it says 18, what's the date there?
66.
Correct, 1866. And can you read what it says above that? With another number.
32.
It's 32 P for 32 pound shot. That would be the size of the cannonball that would go in these puppies. You can also see the stamp up here on the top for the Cyrus Alger Company, which was the Boston manufacturer of these cannons. Their Frank is right here, Cyrus Alger and Company. This is 223 and that cannon is 225, and on both of them you see the seal of the U.S. Navy right here. These came to the city as surplus. We don't know exactly when. We have pictures from World War I with people posing in front of these cannons, so we know they've been here since at least that time. People also ask if these cannon are similar to the ones that are down at Stark Park. Anybody know that answer? No. They're not cousins. Well, they might be cousins, distant cousins, but they're not a match. Those are Revolutionary era cannon, which the city got from the federal government. So these are not functional. They never have been. They've been decorative. There were actually 4 of these up here at one time because we have photographs from around World War II that were aerial photographs apparently taken from the west towards here, probably from an airplane, maybe a helicopter. And there were 4 of these cannon out front, but they haven't been here for quite a while. As we walk down the hill here, you're going to see the ground is quite uneven, so just watch your footing. This tour will go through the woods a little bit. There's some paved paths and there's also some cinder paths, so you get a little of everything. It's not difficult. There is one fairly long stretch of downhill, and then there will be one stretch of uphill on the other side. But it's probably moderate difficulty for walking. So let's head down towards the fence and stop right down there before we go into the waterworks property.
So what happened to the other 2 cannons?
The city is quite sure that some former New Hampshire college students had a fair amount of liquor one night and came up here with a truck and carted one of them away, which would have taken quite an effort because these are very heavy.
Yeah.
They don't really know what happened to the other one, but it's been missing for many years.
That's when it was on.
If I can direct your attention over there, you see a little building and a large basin covered with a tarpaulin. This is this same basin probably about a century ago. You can see the little building. The 2 communications towers, of course, were not there at that time.
Sorry.
That is one of the 2 reservoirs on this property that are operated by Manchester Waterworks. Basically, this whole area is all owned by the city, including Darrowfield Park proper. Darrowfield Park was formed at the design of Alderman Lucian Clough in 1890. He wanted he wanted a place in town where people could come and enjoy the outdoors. Because in 1890, Darrowfield Park was the country. And you figure most people lived right downtown. Most people walked where they were going. They didn't have cars. If you had a horse and buggy, even going to Darrowfield Park up that hill would have been quite a journey. And the trolley cars didn't go that far in those days. So they purchased about 68 acres of land, which became the original Darrowfield Park. And I want to show you another depiction of how that was intended to look originally. Didn't end up that way, of course. We'll let the camera operator here get a picture first, and then we'll pass this around. Darrowfield Park, as proposed, was going to be a beautiful place. This is Bridge Street along the bottom, Mammoth Road up here along the north-south margin. And what we know today is Hillside Junior High School or middle school would have been right up about here where this looks like it was supposed to be a pond or a body of water. First thing is, where Hillside is, there is a fairly high water table down there, and that area does flood a lot, so it wouldn't have been too hard to create a body of water on purpose. But this had all sorts of paths, a lot of treed areas. It was going to be these circular things for horse and buggy use. It was supposed to be a planted, really nicely organized park. What do you suppose happened?
Money ran out.
The city of Manchester ran out of money. It's always the case. We'll just pass that around to anybody else who'd like to take a look at it. So Darrowfield Park started at 68 acres, and by 1900 it had expanded to about 89 or 90 acres. And this was all part of it. This part is maintained by the Manchester Waterworks. It's hard to believe, but there's about, if I get my numbers correct, I think 11 million gallons of water in that basin. There's a time when some of the older folks in town remember when there was no tarp and you could actually see the water. They had to cover that up in more recent years because of the EPA and health and safety reasons. Obviously birds can fly over that and droppings can occur, and that's no good for anybody. So in order to protect the water supply of the city, they've got the fence built around it. It's all part of the original city reservoir system, which starts out at Lake Massabesic, which actually touches the borders of 8 communities, I believe, or is served by 8 communities. The waterworks treats the water for drinking quality out there and then pumps it up to here. And then this holding tank and the one behind me are both used to gravity feed water down to our houses and businesses in downtown. There's another waterworks reservoir, another holding tank, actually 2 holding tanks down Mammoth Road near Cohos Avenue, which was just completed in the last couple of years. It replaced an earlier structure. This is the smaller tank. This one, I believe, holds 18 million gallons. And this too was originally all carved out. This entire basin was blasted out of this rock hill, and you could see the water in it at one time. But this concrete holding tank is a much more recent application. This basin was blown up during the during the Depression. It was part of the Works Progress Administration. The workers actually came up here with dynamite and very elementary tools and created this basin. This one goes back to the late 1800s and would have been dug by hand. The communications towers are much more recent, probably 1950s and 60s. The city put them there originally for fire department, thank you, and police department usage. The highway department's also up there, but today they rent out space to a number of private telecommunications concerns. And on a good day, you can sometimes see really big birds that live up there. They have nests sometimes, although I don't see the nests from this angle. But the birds like it as a vantage point. So there's a lot of commercial communications. People who've been around town for a while will remember a time when you could drive up Bridge Street and you could see the Weston Observatory from Bridge Street. But the tree growth has been a recurring theme here, and it's been a problem because, as you can see, the trees are now higher than the tower.
Yeah.
You used to be able to see Boston on a clear day. You can see the Prudential Center. Rarely, if the sun is shining, you can look to the north and see Mount Washington. You were not able to see it today because of the cloud cover. But as these trees keep getting taller and taller, it encroaches on the growth of the city, and you can't just chop off the tops of trees. You have to chop the whole tree, and the city hasn't got the budget for that. This area that we're standing on was treed until about 6 years ago, and the city did bring in a private contractor to take a lot of lumber out of here. They have trimmed back the sides a little bit in recent years, but it's too expensive a proposition. So we're going to walk down the fence line here and just keep going until we stop. How's that?
This is not connected to Lake Massapequa in any way.
It is. It's pumped up here from Massapequa to these two tanks. Yeah. If anybody's hungry, we're having an abundant crop of acorns here. Help yourself. And this is the larger of the two reservoirs that you see. This is before the concrete tank. This was when the water was still visible. The smaller one where the tarp was is this one. And this would be Mammoth Road back here in the background, which would be roughly out there. We had a good question about whether that tower is actually at the highest point in Manchester, and it is not. In fact, this hill is known as Oak Hill, but in the olden days it was known as Heath Hen Hill, if you want to pass that around. Heath Hen was a brand of rooster, a native chicken that used to run around on the hills up here. And this area was known as Heath Hen Hill because they used to roam wild. So Heath Hen Hill was thought to be Manchester's highest point until they started to build out on what we now know as Wellington Hill, which originally was known as Rattlesnake Hill. That's actually about 50 feet higher than this is. So when you take into account that that's a 66-foot tower on a pretty high hill, Rattlesnake Hill is still a little higher because they have a water tank up on top of Wellington Hill today. So technically, that area just east of us is a little bit higher than we are here. I think the variation, though, is something like 300 feet from here down to sea level, down to the Merrimack River. So obviously we know there's a pretty good-sized hill that goes down into town. So this area is still Waterworks property, but you can tell that they don't want you in here. There's the barbed wire fence and then the razor wire fence inside it. Anybody know why they have that there?
Vandals.
No, not specifically. Not entirely. Not animals. It's trespassers. The reason is that if you go down to the path here, to where that tree is at an angle across the path, just past that to the left is a hole in the fence. We're not going there, but you can come back at some time and be there illegally on your own. That would take you into what was known as the Amoskeag Quarry, or the Ledge. Now, the Amoskeag Quarry was founded in the 1870s. They needed a supply of granite for all the curbing and the building foundations down in the mill yard. And because this whole hill is built on rock, I mean, just look at the path and look what we're standing on, you can see all this granite. This is where they mined it. The Amoskeag Quarry was never a huge employment opportunity. There were maybe, at its most, a couple of dozen workers who were there. But they used to take large slabs of granite out of here after mining it by hand, and they would have either horse and buggy or oxen and buggy to bring it downtown, usually by Blodgett Street, because that was the most direct path. And if I can just take the book back, I'll find another photo for you to look at to show you what this looked like as a quarry. Someday I'll organize these better, but that would be for the high-priced tour. Here we go. So this is what a granite quarry would look like. They would slice off large chunks of granite. And you see a little tiny man down here at the bottom to give you an idea what the depth of this quarry was. This operated from roughly 1870 till somewhere in the mid-1880s. We don't know exactly what happened to it. Why not, Ed? How come we don't know what happened to it? Well, there's 2 or 3 different stories, and they're all written after the fact. We have combed through all the newspapers of the era, and there was no news story that said, Amoskeag Quarry floods. That is what happened, but we don't know exactly when. The contemporary stories were written 10, 15 years later, so the date's kind of fuzzy. Part of that was because in those days there wasn't much media, there was no television, there was no radio, there was only newspaper, and this would have been on private land. This was all owned by the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. The Amoskeag Company is the group of Boston area investors who put their money into building a textile city along the Merrimack River. They realized the river was big enough that they could tap the power to run the machines, and they could build a whole city, a thriving textile industry here. So the Amoskeag Company is the outfit that actually started the quarry. They got the rock out of it as much as they could, and then one day, apparently, it started to flood. There are varying opinions. This is an actual picture which I'll pass around of the Amoskeag Ledge at its height. You'll see some wooden derricks, some cables. You'll see some men and carts and animals down at the bottom. We don't know precisely what happened or when, but the story goes that it started to flood, and they came back the next day, and there was 18 feet of water where they had been working the day before. So they had abandoned all their tools, and it was all lost. And in time, the 18 feet of water became much deeper than that. And in fact, by 1890, the Amoskeag Ledge was a very popular swimming attraction. We have documented at least 11 drownings in the ledge over the years. People who, in a couple of cases, committed suicide. In many cases, they weren't trained swimmers and they went under. A couple of times there were diving accidents. But the Amoskeag Ledge would be roughly right back here, and there's two places that we'll pass on this tour. One hole in the fence is just beyond that angled piece of wood, and the other one will be on the other side, on the McIntyre side. It became a popular swimming area, and we'll talk more about that and its life as we continue up this path to the left.
About 35 years ago, Ed, I walked around it, so there's no fence there then. There's water in it then.
The fence went in, I believe, I'll have to check my date in here. It was in the early 1980s. There were 2 consecutive summers of drownings, and the city alderman under Mayor Emil Bolio said, that's it, we're going to build a fence all the way around the perimeter.
Okay.
And that goes back to the barbed wire part of it, too. As we go through the perimeter, you'll see that there's razor wire inside the fence to keep people from jumping over the top, because if you land on sharp or rusty wire, you're in for a bad time.
Well, I know back then it was in the wintertime, and if you walk too close to the edge, you could slip and fall and get hurt.
Absolutely.
So, and there's water in it then, too. So.
Let's just head up this path.
What year was that?
I'd say about
I think it was 84.
85 years ago.
That would be about right.
I like that store.
Ben Franklin's.
Oh yes, there aren't many of
And
those
it
around.
just had closed down this year in Middlebury, Vermont.
Oh my God. So,
So in the reservoir, how does it maintain its water level? As it gets down so much, it just
I don't know the
water
mechanics of
from
it.
Massabesic.
We have people. We're going this way. Just watch your step on this.
Cross-country runners run up here or something?
Yeah, this is the city high school cross-country path. I think there was a meet here last weekend. You become my book holder. You're doing a great job. Thank you very much.
So there's a sign for cross-country, is that?
Yes, this is part of the city's high school cross-country tour. There was an arrow back there, which you can see on a tree. So they regularly run up here from the city high schools. And you're probably getting the idea by looking at the lay of the land that this is very rocky, and this would not be good farmland. Whereas Darafield Park proper, the lower part along Bridge Street, was fertile, and that was used for farmland at various times. In fact, that was the Manchester City Poor Farm for years. If you were indigent, you had bills and you couldn't pay them, they would have you go work at the Manchester Poor Farm. Many of you have probably seen that silly door that seems to be standing there on Reservoir Avenue. That used to have a stone wall around it in a big circle. It was the city's pound, not for dogs, but for any animal that got loose anywhere in town, they would put it in the pound, and that's where you'd go to retrieve it. The only remnant of that that's still existing is the door itself. So this area was never used for farming up here. There's just too much rock to make farming possible. There were people who owned this, and some of the private ownership of this land was the Kennard family. K-E-N-N-A-R-D, Kennard Road. That's where you go to get into the Darafield, to the McIntyre ski area parking lot. We're going to talk more about the Kennards as we get up here to the top of the ski area. As we come around the corner here, the ski area asks you to please not go up and touch their equipment on this little hill. They ask people to just stay off of that, but we're going to stop right over here on the gravel. Gather right around here. Okay. Obviously, we all started at the Weston Tower, which is one of Manchester's 2 stone towers. Where's the other one? We're in the vicinity. You all see that water tower that says VA? That's the VA Medical Center atop of Smith Road. It has this tower at its base. This was built by the governor of, another governor and mayor, Frederick Smith. He was both mayor of Manchester and governor of New Hampshire. He's the other one. And he built his own stone tower because that was his family land where the VA hospital is today. Smith was from, I can't remember if it was Auburn or Candia originally. Do you remember, Matt? But he used to walk in as a young man to Manchester to find his fame and fortune, and that was the route he walked in on. So his family eventually settled up there, and he made his summer vacation place there because that was 3 miles out of Center City. That was considered distant country. And it was up higher, so it didn't have the smells of the mills and the river and all that kind of stuff. So Smith built this for his own personal recreation. This was never built for enjoyment of the citizens, although this is on the National Register of Historic Places, as this tower is. But the reason I started to pull this out was to show you the lay of the land. You can see how this drops into a pretty substantial basin, which is why it makes a great ski area. This came about in the late 1960s. The city wanted to build the ski area, but it involved taking 12 properties that were owned by private homeowners, including some of the Kennard land. Kennard Road is basically on the other side of here. So the city seized that land, built the ski area. Here it is ever since. Now it's run by a private concern. As the slope goes down here, imagine that you're at the high end of the Amoskeag Ledge. And you'd be kind of looking at this view. This was what it looked like once the quarry itself had flooded with water, and it would have all been down here below us, behind us. We're going to actually walk the perimeter and get quite close to this, but this gives you an idea what the lay of the land would have looked like. It was a pretty substantial drop-off in elevation and a pretty substantial body of water. We know that it was at least 55 feet deep because there was a famous place called Old 55. It was a point that you could jump into the water from the rocks and go 55 feet to hit the water's surface. How much deeper it was below that is subject to conjecture. We have some reports that it was as much as 20 or 30 feet deep below that. Hard to tell for sure. We'll talk more about what happened to this in a few minutes. But just watch your step on this gravel because it's loose, and we did have a little bit of rain this morning, so it's a little bit wet. Just be very careful going downhill. Stop right about here. About 2 years ago, McIntyre wanted to expand and build a snowboarding course. So they did some clearing in this area, and they clear cut all of this. This all used to be treed right through here. And as I understand it, this was for snowboarding on this side of the hill. Coincidentally, the other reason we stopped here is because we are at the other hole in the fence. Voila. I don't recommend you go in there, and I'll tell you why. You can see the chain link fence, but if you look really closely right here, just a couple of feet inside, there's the remnants of barbed wire, and there's also some very sharp razor wire, brown in color. It's been here since the mid-1980s, so it's had 35 years to get a good coating of rust on it, and you'd get a great case of tetanus if you were to get cut by it. The city clearly does not want people inside this perimeter. You also, if you just look up over this rise, you get the feeling how much it dives down into the ledge itself. This is one of the best vantage points. I've been in there and walked down in there, and it falls quite substantially. There's a pretty good basin down below that. And you'll see that a little later as we go down the hill. As we get down here, there's going to be it's a few feet away yet, but there's like a cement barrier across the road. Just don't trip on that. You get the idea that it goes down quite a bit. I need a helper. Who can tell me what graffiti is? Does anybody know what graffiti is?
Spray painting.
Yeah, graffiti is spray painting. When
Some
people
of them consider pictures.
Well, it's a form of art to some. To others, it's a form of litter. Graffiti is when people take spray paint and they spray it on stuff that doesn't belong to them. This area inside the ledge, inside the fence, is loaded with it. And there's an area right here that if you look straight across, you'll see a patch of blue about a foot square. That's one of the most visible vantage points inside the ledge fence. I don't know, Paul, if you can see that. It's where the sun seems to be shining on a patch of yellow bushes. Is there somebody there now? Yeah, they walk by. They go through the other hole in the fence to get there, and you can really look down into the basin. So what happened? Where did all that water go? The story is that there had been a long fight between the city and the Amoskeag Company and the public about whether this should be open to the public or not. In the 1930s, the Amoskeag Company said, we're done, we're never going to start a quarry again, and we don't want the insurance liability of people drowning. So they said, they sold it to the city for $1. So now it was the city's problem. There also was a group up here called the Manchester Brownies. Now these are not the Brownies that are part of the Girl Scout organization. This was like the Boston Brownies, the L Street Brownies. To belong to the Brownies, you had to swim outdoors every day for a consecutive 365 days. And this is where they did it. This group came up and they were an organized swimming club. And they used to come up here. Dan Connor was their leader. And it was mostly kids, but there were a few young adults in it as well. And they used to swim regularly. Because Dan Connor was a stickler for training, there was never any documented incidents of any of their members drowning or even being hurt up here. They used to put on 4 annual shows each year, 1 in each season. And I'll pass around a picture of what it looked like when they had some of the huge crowds. They would bring, according to the newspapers of the day, up to 15,000 people would come out here in the woods and ring this basin to watch the stunts. They would put on skits, diving exhibitions, and a variety of other little plays. And as soon as I find it, there's actually 2 photos I'll show you. The first shows a hole that they cut in the ice. Now they had to do that manually with shovels and picks. And then the divers would go off this little platform they had built. And there's about a dozen people who are in the water here. This is December, and the only intelligent person in the whole picture is that dog who said, I'm not going in that water. You see the dog? But all those people are in there.
It looks like a duck.
And this was the perimeter road, if you could call it that, on the south facing of this basin. Where that group of people in the spray paint is, that would have been over there. So people used to go in here and have these exhibitions, and this next picture shows you the crowds. Now this particular one happened to be a summer exhibition, you can tell by the clothing, but you can see that the people would ring the rocks. They would get right up on the cliffs overlooking this. June, July, not so much of a problem. February, that's a problem. You step on a piece of ice that's coming out of a rock, you could suddenly be down in the drink yourself. There was one incident about 1922 when the Brownies were staging one of their winter carnivals and they had thousands of people here. And a number of them had walked out on what they thought was frozen ice, and they encroached a little too far and the ice gave way, and about a dozen people got dunked, but they just took them to the nearest houses on Mammoth Road back here and dried them out, and everybody was fine. No fatal injuries. But this size crowd, that danger of people falling through the ice, became an increasing problem for the city. The police department said there's no way that we can wall off this entire hill. We can't keep people out of there. We could put every cop in the city up there and we couldn't prevent a tragedy. So there was this growing battle between the public who wanted to come swimming here and watch these exhibits, and the first thing they did was to shut down the Brownies. They said after a certain date, which I think was 1933, you can't swim here, you can't have access to this anymore. So they relocated for a couple of years down to Brown Avenue, to the pond down near Pine Island Park, and they kind of ran their course and went out of business. But then you still had the public sneaking up here in the good weather, getting inside, and they had not yet built this fence. What happened was, in the 1980s, there were 2 back-to-back summers where there were fatal drownings. In both cases, they were late at night. Kids or young people had gotten in here after being out partying, and drownings occurred, and Mayor Bolio said, that's enough, I want to close the ledge. So he had the City Parks and Rec build this perimeter fence all the way around here, and we'll talk more about that as we proceed down the path. That stone bunker that's across the path is directly ahead of us here. I'll get on the far side here so we can talk to everybody.
Look at this guy. The tree grew into the fence.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Especially.
Like, look. I'll get right out.
There's a spider web. And this one.
We got everybody here. So you can see that we're now at the lowest end of the ledge, and in fact this footbridge, when there's spring overflow from snow melt and spring rains, it goes right underneath this bridge and drains down to the city sewer on the streets. This would have been also the exit path when they were taking granite out of here when it was an active quarry, because Blodgett Street, if you didn't have these houses here, you'd be going right through to Blodgett. So the question is, what happened to the water? Well, Mayor Bolio in the mid-'80s convinced the aldermen to spend $15,000 to build this perimeter fence. They also said in order to discourage people from breaking in over the fence, we need to actually try to fill the ledge. Well, 55 feet of water over a half-mile stretch, it was an impossible task. They tried. They filled dump truck after dump truck full of leaves and branches and trees and cuttings and dumped it over the side into the basin. And they never really managed to fill that entire basin with water. But what has happened is, in the ensuing 35 years, tree growth has occurred. If you were to go in here and walk up through to the ledge basin, you'd find water still there. But you couldn't really sink into it. You certainly couldn't swim, because if you stand on either the north or the south bank, you can look across the top. It's all treetops under you. This is now filled with tree growth. It's also filled with things like washing machines and old tires and bags of garbage that people have been chucking in this basin for years. At its height, we've documented at least 2 instances of where cars were dumped in here. There was one, a North End dentist back around 1928, had his car stolen from the North End someplace, up in, I think around Salmon Street. And they found it the following spring in here. Somebody had drowned, and they had sent divers in to look for the body, and they didn't find the body. They never did recover it, but they did find his car, and they hauled that out. So people have been known to put all sorts of bizarre things in here. As we're going to go up here, this is that one stretch of uphill that I talked about, and there'll be one more of those concrete barriers to pass. It may look to you like there's a road or a clearing that goes down at a bit of an angle that direction. That indeed is the remnants of a fire road. City Parks and Rec or other authorities could get in there through a locked gate if there was a problem. For example, if they had to do a rescue out of here, or if there was a fire, they could access it through this road. Prepare for one good hill, and then the hard stuff's over. Are you familiar with this property on the right? This would be an off-clear. That thing to trip on.
Keep going.
We'll stop at the top of the hill here. How are you? You weren't expecting so much company, huh? This photograph is from 1956, and what you're looking at here, these 3 rows of granite rocks, are actually the back side or the west side of the reservoir basin. They built it up in these 3 levels. This was all one solid hill of granite until it was built in the 1930s, and they blew up all the loose rock and created all this pack rock to build this structure which holds in that concrete tank and all the water that's in it. So we are roughly, the Weston Observatory would be kind of that way from where we started. We're a little bit over halfway back to where we started from. Anybody want to?
Where all these rocks come from?
Here. They were all here originally, and they blew it up,
Oh, that's
blew up the hill, and then repacked it. So as we get down here, you're going to come to a small section of paving on your right, and see who can figure out what it's there for. Yes.
Is this street high ridge right here?
Yes, this is. In fact, our former MHA president lives just down here. Maybe we should stop in. Yeah, stop in for refreshments.
Ed, you said there's only like 3 openings. 3 openings. Why don't they patch it up?
That's a good question because we've been doing this for 6 years, and those 2 holes have been in the same places the entire time.
I know. I thought your answer would be no sense to make holes again, but if there's only 3,
Well, people probably would. I don't doubt that they would.
in fact, any kids can get through that or something.
Okay, so here's a piece of paving. What's this for? It's for nothing, right?
Driving.
Just a parking area.
We don't know exactly why it's here. At one time, we suspect before that house was there, this was a cut-through road. This might have been one of the access points for the fire lane,
Yeah.
or it could have been a turnaround place for trucks, the city trucks that were working up here. It has no apparent function today. They don't certainly plow down this far because this is all dirt. But there it is, and these people can say they look out on an abandoned parking area. There's one great big yellow pillar and I don't know if that's a gas marker or what that might be. But it's just a mystery. There's many mysteries on this tour. Oh, here you go.
So my sister just bought this house.
Oh,
And
okay.
that was 1955, as was that house.
Is that the one with the big rock retaining wall out in front of it? A very high rock retaining wall? The wave at them.
I see the tower.
And if we all get clumped up close together, I'll count to 3. And when we get to 3, everybody shout hello as loud as you can and wave at those people. Let's see if they'll wave back at us, okay? So I'll count to 3 and we all go hello. 1, 2, 3. Hello! Oh, there's a couple of them. Remember when we saw these 2 communications towers before, we were over on the other side of the field, on the other side of that telephone pole. Up ahead here, you'll see this is a pretty pronounced embankment. Now you understand the depth of how much water is stored in here, how they can have 11 million gallons inside this little hill. Usually they have, and I'm not sure it's out today, we'll see when we get up ahead, usually there's a hose coming out of the top of this hill down the embankment. And periodically, especially if we've been in a period of heavy rain, they have to drain this tank. And they do it through the hose down the hill, and I think it is out there. It's a white-looking hose. The problem with this is when they started doing this a couple of years ago, this water would all go right down the hill onto Reservoir Road. And this time of year, early in the morning, it can be cold enough that the road freezes. They were having a real problem with ice. With school buses headed down the hillside, they'd come around that curve and suddenly they'd be on ice. So they have to be careful how they do it, but you can see the hose that's draining down the side here. People often ask, what's in the little building? What do you girls think is in that building?
Nothing.
Is that where they keep the trolls, do you think?
No.
No trolls?
No.
It's actually just machinery as part of the pumping system. There's really nothing to see in there. And there's no birds, but you can see there's a nest at the very top of the left-hand tower.
I
A
see it.
circular thing.
That was like the first thing I spotted. Yeah, I mean.
It's cool to see the really big birds, the raptors and the hawks and stuff.
Which one? Oh, yeah, on the right. Something hanging down there.
See, normally, even though the arrow says go that way, if you were to continue this way, this would be part of the cross-country path, and this would take you right down onto a cinder gravel path that takes you back down to the main road. We're going this way. All these little private buildings behind fences are, well, you can see that one's AT&T, and you'll see their names on them. These are all for private communications concerns for cellular tower and private communications between companies and their fleets of vehicles. The city leases this space to them on the city-owned tower. And the road that you see paved over on this side used to be the main road up here for vehicles. That was long before Louis Israel Martel Drive was on this side. We're going to cut through this path and be aware that there's a log across the path, so it's one more thing to trip over. Oh, thank you. I forgot about that. Thank you.
Sure.
There's coffee.
And this would be a great time for ice cream. Did you bring any?
No.
Oh. None at all?
No.
Wow.
That's funny. What flavor do you?
Doesn't matter because they don't have it. Pick any flavor you want. They don't have it. Well, it looks like you guys all got here at the right time because now it's mobbed up here.
Whoa.
Is this open this weekend period?
Yes, today and tomorrow, 10 till 4 both days.
And that must have been the paper or something for people to view.
It was, yep. And we use Facebook quite a bit to market this as well. So does anybody have any final questions that I can try to answer for you? If I don't know the answer, I'll make one up. Well, thank you all very much for coming to support us today for the Manchester Historic Association. And if you haven't been up the tower yet, and I know several of you hadn't gone, feel free to show your button and go on up.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.